Again, gracias. And now we go on with the presentation of Sampath, who has been with us many times, as many as I have, I think. It's nice to see you, and
Nice to
well,
see
you
you.
can start if you like.
Okay. Should I wait for the recording?
No one recording and keeps the recording.
Oh, okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, I think fine.
Thank you. So es tut mir leid and disculpa me, but I don't have a full paper written. I have some paragraphs and I wanted to spend time reading the actual text of Heidegger in English. I have the German too. But it seems like every 2 years, when I do a presentation at this time, I also have a new Nino, so I didn't have time to do the PowerPoint or the essay. So I apologize, but hopefully we can still have a good discussion. The title of my talk, let me share the text and then we can start. And everybody can see this okay?
Yes.
Sorry. It's neither Denken nor Danken?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll just look here and make sure that I don't have the text. Okay. So the title, neither Denken nor Danken, thinking or thanking. It's a beautiful phrase, Alfred, for the theme of the conference. So I'm not going to do either one. I'm not going to think. I will thank, but we have to question all the different connotations of thanking, being grateful, receiving, exposing ourselves to the other, um, being vulnerable, but as a type of self-empowerment, but reception, and to just be thankful, be grateful. So I am, of course, to be here and to be with you. But we have to get into the text itself, was heißt Denken, what is called thinking, GA8. And that's where I want to spend my time. So in that specific lecture 10, I'll just start reading the first paragraphs and then we'll read the actual text by Heidegger. Specific lecture 10 of part 1 within the 1951-52 lectures, Heidegger invokes being and time, Sein und Zeit. And Alfred, you know this, and many of you know this. These are the first permitted lectures after denazification and the last before his retirement at the University of Freiburg. Not only do they constitute an enormously significant moment in the later Heidegger's thinking, they take us back to arguably the most obscure matter for Heidegger in general, one that runs from his early days to his death, namely that which remains unthought for, and Hakim, the German Ungedacht, maybe I need to, I can bring up the German, but you're asking about the German words. We'll have to go back to the unthought for Western metaphysics, or its own ground and foundation. However much one may dwell in and on the relation between thinking to being in the later Heidegger, we'll come back to the opening moment of the lecture, namely the lifelong quest to question time based on the presence of the now, and the spatialized idea of time as the movement of passing nows. So this is in Was heißt Denken. Of course, it evokes all the great questions in Division 2 of Sein und Zeit and 1927, Basic Problems, the Leibniz book, the Kant book, so many, the few years right after the Four Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, the works right after Being in Time. We will try to go further on this question of the meaning of being of time as its horizon, the horizon of the question, and of being itself, time of being, but time is a horizon for understanding being, the greatest articulation of which occurs in being in time. Furthermore, and this is a very important word for me because I'm going to come back to the Bezug and when Heidegger invokes the Bezug, the interrelatedness of being in time. The interrelatedness of being in time after the 1927 work requires for me a double possibility. Not only questioning the dual arche that beings occur in being and time in Western metaphysics, and as construed as passing now points. So time is construed as passing now points, but why is it that beings in general have to occur in being, the big B, being, Sein, and time? So, and B, so that's part A of the double possibility. The second possibility is the interrelation of time and being as event, Ignis. But for me, this supersedes and conceptualizes the event as passage when we no longer have recourse to the eternal presence of the now. So no linear time and no distended time as a whole as an eternal presence, enslaved by the now. So we can't have either one of these. And of course, they both presuppose the spatialization of time as linear passage consisting of three: present now, future is yet to be now, and past is already now. As I've been saying all along, although I haven't been successful in really articulating it to what it is, because it requires a lot of um, prefatory work to explain what I mean by even the phrase four-dimensional. We hypothesize a four-dimensional temporalizing of temporality as an outgrowth of not only where being and time leaves off in Division 2, but also what remains unthought in the later Heidegger's lectures, such as what is called thinking. This requires us to disassociate time from space, and therefore the history of Western metaphysics and physics for that matter, which is to disassociate time from movement while rethinking the latter two, time and movement, as an impossible relation. So both are irreducible to presence and spatiality. Time from space, time from movement. We're not talking about physics. This is not anything empirical. But it has to do with the fundamental question of metaphysics. Therefore, we can't even go back to Aristotle, that is, not in terms of some being that moves or moves itself or undergoes change, nor, of course, a change of location in space, which remains the same. So Heidegger makes that fundamental ontological distinction in Division 2, Chapter 5, at the very beginning of Section 72, Bewegtheit, the movement of existence, Bewegung, motion as a change of location in space, some object that's moving. And he questions, as you know, from the very early on period, Aristotle's genius to, in some ways, raise the distinction, but also for Heidegger, this is part of the history of metaphysics that he's trying to destroy. Something is buried in here that he needs to unearth and retrieve. We hypothesize a nonlinear, non-circular, and non-rectilinear time interrelational movement event that is four-dimensional. Now, the problem is that this looks very spatial. It uses geometric language. But we do not imagine the simultaneity nor the succession of two events. So that's not going to help us. So it's, why talk about four and numbering, and why do you use all these words? You can't even begin with two events that are either simultaneous or successive. Furthermore, beginning from some kind of abiding, centralizing presence is inadmissible. I don't start with that either. This monstrously strange occurrence lies buried in the unthought ground and foundation that what is called thinking and the other later Heidegger writings evoke, almost endlessly without ever fully articulating its shape or concept. This sounds very Hegelian. Heidegger doesn't want a shape or a concept. That's not the Heidegger project, whether it's being in time, early Heidegger or the late. He's something different, as you all know. How do we think that difference? How do we think Heidegger's relationship to the history of metaphysics? Maybe Hegel wants this, but Heidegger's going to question if you know Hegel. So it's by strategic necessity for Heidegger, because articulating a new concept on the Hegelian scale would re-invoke the metaphysics of presence that Heidegger spent his whole life questioning and destroying in preparation for the passage to another beginning, to go back to the Beiträge. I'll get into Nietzsche a bit because, as you know, he criticizes Nietzsche too. Nietzsche looks like the great destroyer of metaphysics, the eternal return, the will to power. He's doing something different too. No. He's caught up in the same thing. He's the last. He's not destroying. He's the last metaphysician. He's still stuck in the tradition. Heidegger is different. So in short, we have to cross Heidegger's limit, which is a limit instituted by the ontological difference of being and beings itself. We have to necessarily violate his thought in order to get to another side, one that has remained heretofore unthought. So what I'm saying is that it's going to sound naive, but to cross Heidegger's limit means we have to disobey him. We have to look like we're doing metaphysics. We're trying to come up with a concept. It's very complex. It's very spatialized. It's a big idea. It's not Nietzsche's eternal return. It's not this time-spirit relation in Hegel, or what we talked about in the past, the science of logic, the quadruplicity. It's our four-dimensional idea of time. And that looks like it's metaphysics. What are you doing? Why are you at the Heidegger conference if you didn't even understand Heidegger's basic ontological difference? Right now, the only thing we can say about thinking is that it cannot answer the question, what is called thinking? In some senses, the temporalizing, this is being in time, and historizing, Geschehen, to use terms from Division 2 of being time, become murky in the later Heidegger's Lecture 10, was heißt Denken, when he starts to question the origin of linear time as passing away. The Ursprünglichkeit is to get back to the language of being in time. The origin of Innerseitigkeit. Well, why do we even think of within? Why are we within time? We always have to assume we're in time, flowing time, linear time, historical time. How do we understand the temporal horizon of Heidegger's question about thinking when he goes about questioning both linear time founded on passing now points and the eternal substance of an abiding now that is not supposed to pass into the past or arrive from the future? Either of them. In fact, linear time and eternity have to be derived from something more primordial, as Heidegger attempts in Chapter 3 of Division 2. That's ecstatic temporality. That's metaphysics, but don't forget the Christian primordial Christian temporality. He's not into kairos either. He tried to engage that in the phenomenology of religious life. Lived Christian experience of the early church is lived temporality, religiosity of that lived. He's interested in that, of course, in the early 20s. You all know that. The last speaker, I'm trying to remember his name, I apologize, but invoking Boltzmann. But Heidegger is going to be very destructive of the theological concepts too. We know that. Maybe he doesn't spend as much time as he does the history of metaphysics, but so you can't use either one when we think of ecstatic temporality. To go further than Heidegger could do in either the early period up to being in time or the post being in time later period up to the 60s, particularly the lecture on time and being, is the most difficult challenge that we have yet to face. I know some people talk about Thomas Sheehan, and maybe there's a certain newness in the paradigm shift. He always goes back to the lived movement of experience of existence, and of course he has his own complex constructions, which is very interesting. Don't get me wrong, but the fundamental issue is time for me, independent of the question of movement. That sounds very simple, but I'm going to bracket that for now. For all the secondary scholarship over nearly 100 years on the term being and its evolution in Heidegger's corpus, there's been so little on the question of the meaning of time. This also means properly posing the question of the meaning of the question, too, to reinvoke the circular question of the meaning of being, posing the introduction. We have to be very careful. Heidegger says the question of the meaning of being, posing this question anew. Nobody else has done it. All the registers today of being indefinable, universal, necessary, but nobody knows what they're talking about. We're still not thinking about it. The tradition is forgotten. Posing the question of the meaning of being anew, but the meaning of the question. He also says that too. We have to ask the meaning of this. Why are we even raising this question? Let's just assume being and beings are the same, and here we are, and time is linear. Well, don't bother us, Heidegger. Most people, that's how they think anyway. Who has the audacity to question the commonplace notion of linear time as passing now points? Whether present that moves into the past, or the future, or both, while also admitting that a more primordial time means existing finitely. This is from Sein und Sei, section 74, I think, chapter 5. And if it's true that Heidegger, or sorry, no, that's actually section 65, excuse me. And if it is true that Heidegger is the only modern philosopher to have raised this issue down to its depths, a claim that is hard to dispute, then who is Heidegger in his essence? The relationship between Heidegger and Husserl, internal time consciousness. The debates about, oh, well, Bergson, the French guy, is also something unique or different, but as Heidegger says, he makes space-time. So there's something interesting in Bergson, but put him back in the history of metaphysics. He doesn't know how to pose this question. Who is Heidegger? Okay, this is where I want to start reading some of the text from Lecture 10. This is a quote from Lecture 9. So the paragraph right before, I'll read that. And then I'll just slowly read Lecture 10, and I hope to not bore you, langweilig or aburrido, but I want to read the text and try to examine some aspects of it and then raise some questions, and then I'll be finished. So this is from the end of Lecture 9. We are unmistakably reminded of what it is when we are told that someone's time was up. Time is up. The Prüfung examination, you're finished. Sorry. Or your trying to guess an answer, like in a game or a competition, and you have the clock is ticking. Sorry, you didn't give us the answer. The time is up. You have to stop. We don't get any more time. The temporal is what must pass away. So the temporal is what must pass away, and time is the passing away of what must pass away. So something passes away in time, but time is also this passing away. What the heck is this time? It's an aporia. This passing away is conceived more precisely as a successive flowing away of the now, out of the not yet now, coming out of the future, and it's going into the past. He says this in 65, 69, 72. Like, we always talk about it going in the direction of the future, but we never talk about, we'd easily talk about going towards the beginning, but not as in going back to the past. But why do we always think of it one way? Past is done, and here's the new future. It's coming tomorrow, et cetera, et cetera. Why do we have to commit to that? So here he's raising the aporia. It's what passes away, but that's how things pass away too, and it's one direction, the succession. Time causes the passing away of what must pass away, and does so by passing away itself. It does both. Now he's getting this from Book 4, The Physics of Aristotle, Chapter 10. Give Aristotle some credit. He's perplexed, of course, about this. It's the limit of it having to now contain its two negative parts, this permanent and dialectic. So it's the limit of something to bound itself, and yet it cannot exist without referring itself to something that's passing away or something that's coming. So we know, I don't want to get into all the paradoxes of Aristotle's physics. Heidegger's the master of that. But let's keep in mind, it's what passes away itself, but also this is what allows things to pass. Kant's substance is permanence. Yet it itself can pass away only if it persists. This is the Kantian substance. Time is that which does not change in order for change to take place within it. It's that dialectical paradox. Hegel tries to resolve this differently. Only if it persists through all the passing away. Time consists in passing, in the persistence, in the Ständigkeit, in the constancy, in the, I don't want to get too fast, but in Sein und Zeit, the Erstreckung. It's the persistence that he's concerned about. Anybody can think about passing away. Look, no, I've already lost 15 minutes of this talk. We're always passing away. We're getting older. We're going to die. But it is in its being, here's the aporia, in that it's constantly not. This is the representational idea that characterizes the concept of time, the begriff, which is standard throughout the metaphysics of the West. So we Western people, we have to just, you're not going to solve this problem of how can the paradox is the being of becoming, time is and it isn't. When it is, it isn't, and when it's not, it is. Augustine, there's plenty of variations in Plato. You can go back in there and keep on trying to understand the mystery of it, or you can do something different. And we know that's for sure the later Heidegger is doing something different. Okay, but I'm fascinated. These are my favorite things in life. Actually, I'm spending more time with the Grundbegriff, the 27 right after being done, because that's supposed to be the part 2 in division 3, supposed to solve all the ending of being time before the Kant book. There's no way you can understand, for me anyway, anything in Heidegger at all if you don't memorize book 4 of Aristotle's physics. But then on top of that, my, I guess, heterodox perspective in the scholarship is that reading of Hegel at the end of Division 2 is flawed. Derrida tries to deal with this too in the 60s, and Lucien Gramme in 1968. That he says, Heidegger, you weren't fair to Hegel. Don't simplify him. And you weren't fair to Aristotle either. And me, Derrida, I'm going to give you something different than your ontological difference, the difference that he speaks of. Let's leave that aside. We don't get that. But anyway, we don't have to trust it. It was too fast. In section 82, it's the last section, 483. And he leaves the open work, the question open. He goes, I don't know if I can't resolve this right now, my treatment of Hegel. I'm just going to try to show that's the most radical conception of the ordinary sense of time from Aristotle, the linear time. I mean, if we had time, I wish we could talk about absolute knowing and the phenomenology to say, no, it's much more complex. In fact, he's filling up a shape of movement that's not linear or circular. And that's what the notion would be ultimately, is time is the concept which is there. Der da ist. very complex structure of time, concept of time, not the human time. So where is the text? Um, that's the German. I want to just stop sharing and make sure I share again so we can see it. And like I said, I do have the German, but can everyone see this? What is the origin? Alfred, can you see this? What is the origin of this long familiar?
Uh, I can see it. What's the
Yeah,
origin of this long
yeah,
familiar?
good. Okay, so this is the English lecture 10, uh, what is called thinking. And the series of lectures, as I mentioned, the first he was allowed to give after the denazification and before his retirement. But it's one of the most famous phrases in the later Heidegger, in addition to only God can save us, is in what is the most thought-provoking thing in this thought-provoking age is that we're not thinking. So everybody loves to quote that. Um, that's the most thought that we're not even thinking. Whatever technology and this and that, modern age, that's a bunch of other stuff. Like we're really not thinking. That's sad for modern Western man to end up like that. But that's a very thought-provoking thing. What do we do? Right? For me, it's because these precious few pages here that unless we get to the fate of Western metaphysics on the time problem, then that's why we're not thinking. We just, including Heidegger, how much time did he spend after being in time in 1927 to 31? Basic Problems, Kant, Aristotle, two books on Kant, Leibniz, back to Aristotle on metaphysics, and then Hegel's Phenomenology, 1931, as far as I can see. And then Nietzsche's big volumes in the 30s. But he didn't, spend explicitly. There are moments, but this is very explicit to me. What is the origin of this long familiar idea of time is that which passes away? The temporal is what must pass away. Did this definition of time drop out of the sky like an absolute? Is it obvious merely because it's been current for so long? How did this idea of time gain currency? How did it get into the current of Western thought? And he's not asking like an historian. Maybe the non-West, the East, before Greece and Rome. He doesn't want to admit it. Hegel doesn't want to admit it, but whoever's before Greece and Rome, prehistory for Hegel, definitely the Eastern traditions. So I don't want to disrespect them, but I'm just telling you this is what Hegel and Heidegger would say. We're not dealing with the non-West and the East. I think some of us are very interested in that question, but we can ask about this origin of time in the West. But the point is that this linear time came in, and we have anxiety and our guilt and our conscience. They're equiprimordial. We're finite, yet we don't want to be a slave to this linear time, the clock ticking or years passing. We think of the whole Legantenheit of our Dasein, the stretchedness of everything in between our birth and our death, as he says, and yet he doesn't know the Geschehen, the historizing of this as an event. How do we grasp the whole totality of this? Well, as you all know, the paradox is that we can't get to that whole until we die. But then we can't experience that either. It's not just perishing and it's the totem. It's the greatest possibility to be. But we're lifted out of that possibility to experience it. Yet it closes us off too. So that's the being in time problem. That's Heidegger's great originality, by the way. If time is it is time. It is time. Right now is the time. It is high time finally to think through this nature of time and its origins so that we may reach the point where it becomes clear that all metaphysics leaves us something essentially unthought, its own ground and foundation. This is the ground on which we have to say that we're not yet truly thinking, as long as we think only metaphysically. And as you know, what that means is that you can get back into metaphysics like all the previous metaphysicians and say, well, wait a minute, I want to conceptualize time, but it's something that disappears and it's got all these paradoxes. And does it have existence, as Aristotle says? Is it part of being or not being? How can this thing that exists have parts of it that don't exist, the past and the future? Let's all play around that. And thank God for our forum because, the analytic philosophers, maybe they have a lot of complicated things to say, but the analytic reception of Aristotle and Plato. But I'm not I'm into Heidegger. I believe in Heidegger's critique, so I don't want to deal with the traditional metaphysical speculations, which can get very complicated, like Alfred Whitehead. It's the unthought. We all want this primordial, perspectful Danken relationship to the unthought. This is the ground in which we have to say that we're not yet truly thinking as long as we think metaphysically. When metaphysics inquires into the nature of time, it will necessarily have to ask its questions in the way that it is in keeping with its general manner of inquiry. Metaphysics asks, the famous Tito on, what is being? Starting from being, it asks for the being of beings. What in beings is in being? And what does the being of being consist? Early Heidegger had the ambition of fundamental ontology. Time is the horizon, if in which time has any being. Let's get to time. He didn't do it. Care, it ends. Failure. But he comes back. He hasn't crossed out the word time or did the medieval or the ancient Germanic spelling with the S-E-Y-N, but he's just saying being. And what does the being of being, what does the being of beings consist? With reference to time, this is to say, what if time is truly in being? Well, that's great. It's also in Aristotle. In accordance with this manner of inquiry, time is conceived as something that in some way is the being of time. Time is part of the is. It's in being, is being, has being. So the question of being is raised. It's Physics, Book 4. Oops. Chapter 10 through 14. That book has given a classic development of this manner of inquiry. And the answer Aristotle gives to this question of the essential nature of time still governs Nietzsche's idea of time. Nietzsche, the great critic, the revenge against the past is revenge. We're slaves of the past, guilt. As soon as the movement of time being flux freezes and there's a past back there that we're stuck with, Nietzsche hates that then we feel bad and we're slaves to good evil distinction, and we're weak, we're slave morality, will to power one's Zarathustra. He's challenging that linear conception of time, but he doesn't articulate the eternal term. Heidegger, as you know, tries to say, Nietzsche, you're not a great critic. You're stuck in the same. All subsequent conceptions of time have their roots in this basic Aristotelian idea of time, which is implicit in Greek thought. That does not exclude, it includes the fact that individual thinkers such as Plotinus, Augustine, the Neoplatonic tradition, Augustine, of course, Leibniz, Kant, Hegel, Schelling, interpret the same situation in different directions. That's amazing. Section 81, before section 82 in Being and Time, he gives us a nice quote from Plato's Timaeus. Time is the moving image of eternity. Then he goes to Aristotle and Augustine. If you don't have a soul, presumably human beings, you're not going to access time. Time may not exist. It can't exist without the soul. So goes with Aristotle. And then Augustine, a great, beautiful question by Augustine. I don't know what time is. It is when it is and it's not. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's some kind of extendedness, which is kind of like the Estrecum of the soul itself. That's all. That's the traditional foundations of metaphysics. Heidegger's destroying that. Then the German idealists come along. Of course, they question it in very complicated ways, but he puts them in the same thing. Maybe that's not fair. But that's what he does. What is the situation in regard to time? What if time has being? And he repeats the question. As soon as metaphysical thought poses this question, once we are even intrigued by this question, something's wrong with us. We're lost. We're forgotten. We've lost ourselves. That's the problem. And it culminates in technological modernity. Don't get caught up in this metaphysical question. Let's escape it. Let's just try to question, why do we even have to be involved in this question? What if time is being? It has already decided for itself what it understands by in being, within being, and in what sense it thinks the word being. And being means being present. More hand in height, zoom hand in height. Beings are more in being, the more present they are. We're present right now on Zoom. We're looking at each other. Beings come to be more present, the more abidingly they abide. Think of the Javalikite. The more lasting the abiding is. What in time is present, and therefore of the present? Only the now? The future, anticipation, worry, concern, anxiety, or to do something tomorrow? Is the not yet? The past is no longer. I'm guilty. I did something. It's over. I wish I didn't do it. I feel bad. The future is what is still absent. The past is what is already absent. And being present in time at that given moment is only that narrow ridge of the momentary fugitive now, rising out of the not yet now, falling into the no longer now. It says all these things again, if you recall in being in time. Where I lost myself. Today's reckoning in sports, for instance, with tenths of a second, in modern physics, even with millions of a seconds, does not mean that we have any keener grasp of time and thus gain time. Such reckoning is, on the contrary, the surest way to lose essential time and so to have always less time. Remember in chapter 6, section 80? It's that self-reckoning. Dasein has to reckon with time in its ordinary registers, historical time, calendar time, world time. It's in that reckoning that you can't even reckon unless there's this prior, primordial temporalizing of temporality that's thrown, that the thrown Dasein is allowed to even experience anything like have a relationship to like time, like ordinary time. Thought out more precisely, the growing loss of time is not caused by such a time reckoning. Rather, this time reckoning began at the moment when man suddenly became unrestful because he had no more time. What's the origin of that? Is that the origin of the Western fear of death, which required Christianity as a solution? What do you mean running out of time? Look at this, though. He's jumping from the ancient. This is also the beginning of the modern age. That's the nihilism. That's the technology. It's running around constantly. Don't know what we're doing. We have no idea what's happening. And as you can see today, the world is falling apart anyway. It's a terrible place to exist in the world right now, with all the wars and death and suffering. What in time is in being present, the now of the given moment, but each now is in its present being by the virtue of its passing. Future and past are not present. They are something which we may never simply say that they are being present. So they're suspicious. If you remember the past and make it present, that's not the authentic past. If you really anticipate the future, I know that I have to end the talk and go help my wife with the baby. That's not the non-present future. That's the anticipation of the impending nature of my own living finitely and living temporality as a finite entity. Certainly not the resolute being towards death, which makes me authentic. It's the Das Man. It's just, I got to do the next thing. But they're not simply present. According to Aristotle, therefore, the future and the past are ne on t, and by no means an uk on, something that is entirely without being, uk, not without the on, without being. There is something that lacks presence. Augustine says exactly the same thing, for example, in the commentary on the 38th Psalm. Nihil de preterito vocatur quod futurum est transitorum expectatur. Nothing of what has passed will be called back. That's too bad. What is of the future expected is something that will pass by. That's a great phrase in the song. I mean, you can't get the past back. It's done. And you better be vigilant and wait because you're going to miss the future as it's passing by. And later in the same passage, he almost follows Aristotle verbatim when he says, a est a non est, and is and not is. May 4:419. The essential nature of time is here conceived in the light of being, and let us note it is well of a totally specific interpretation of being. Being is being present. This interpretation of being has been current so long, we regard it as self-evident. That's what we're trapped in. Now, to destroy this doesn't mean you just go make up something else. It's this feeling and longing to understand why we're trapped by this. And perhaps the Gelassenheit would be the type of freeing, which later Heidegger, of course, explores in many different ways, maybe through the fourfold and other things, as an antidote to the modern problems that we have. Since all metaphysics from the beginning of Western thought, being means being present, being. If it is to be thought in the highest instance, must be thought as pure presence, as the presence that persists. Now we're getting to something mystical, the presence that persists, that continues and stays in the abiding oneness that we have. Time doesn't really pass, but we're there. Plenty of mystical traditions, Western and Eastern, they have this. I don't want to speak to them. I don't want to tell you how to feel about that. I mean, but that's definitely not. That's what being in time tries to do, destroy. We can't go with that. The abiding presence is steadily standing now. Medieval thought speaks of the Nook stance. It could be the mysteries of the Kairos, which St. Paul and the Gospel writers they are struggling with. Some church fathers, as they try to interpret the death scene on the cross, that the actual event of death, when he did die, everything froze to swan. For a moment, everything stood still. It stopped. Time stopped. Frozenness. Then, of course, the earthquakes and the curtain being torn. Death was conquered. Devil was conquered. And that was the saving moment. Medieval thought speaks of the Nook stance, but that is the interpretation of the nature of eternity. It's very theology too complex. Theology, Trinity and Christology, the pre-existent logos, the Gospel of John, relationships between the Trinity, earthly time, human time, and then eternal time. But look at this. Let us recall from a moment the explanation Schelling has the statement, willing is primal being. He says that among the predicates of primal being, there are eternity, independence of time. That gets into complicated later Schelling aspects. Actually, 1809, the response to the phenomenology, treatise on the essence of human freedom. Heidegger has a lecture on that. If all metaphysics thinks of being as eternity and independence of time, it means precisely this. The idea of beings sees them in their being independent of time. The idea of time sees time in the sense of passing away. What must pass away cannot be the ground of the eternal. That's the common notion of time passing away. How can that be eternal? Eternal is persists the abiding now. A now that doesn't have to worry about past or future, going into past, future coming. To be properly beings in a being means to be independent. Excuse me. This is the last paragraph, then I'll be done. If all To be properly beings in their being means to be independent of time in the sense of passing away. We've got to get this independence. But what about that definition here, left unintended, of being itself as being present even as the enduring presence? We don't want the internal enduring presence. Don't want to repeat what Aristotle and Augustine said. Plato, time as the moving image of eternity. Nobody wants the commonplace on your time. That's what non-philosophers do. That's what the Das Man does. Okay, today's this, and tomorrow I'm looking at the clock. What about being as the being present in whose light time was conceived as the passing away, and even eternity is the present now? Is not this definition of being ruled by the view of presence, the present ruled as by the view of time, and if time is such as we can never surmise, let alone think, with the help of the traditional time concept? We cannot use the traditional time concept to go back to its origin. So the origin is rooted in something else. What about being in time then? Almost like the book, but he's now saying just in general, these two big words. Must not one as much as the other, being as much as time, must not both become questionable in their relatedness? The Bezug. And so you have the passage. You see the Bezug being questioned, the Fragliche Bezug. Back to that. In their relatedness, first questionable and finally doubtful. And does not this show then that something was left unthought at the very core of the definition, which is regarding as guiding all Western metaphysics, something essential in the essential nature of being? Question being in time points to what is unthought in all metaphysics. That's exactly right. Being in time and the later, I don't want to get into the debates, continuity, discontinuity, they both point to this unthought. Metaphysics consists of this unthought matter. That's what we can define metaphysics as. Don't say it's an answer to being, and being is this and that, and I have a big system that can answer what it is. Tell people, hey, this is what being is. What is unthought metaphysics is therefore, it's not a defect. Doesn't make us poor or broken. There's a power here in this unthought. Still less must we declare metaphysics to be false or even reject it as wrong, a mistake on the grounds that it rests upon this unthought matter. So I stop here, stop sharing, and I can try to begin my conclusions. So what I get out of this text and what I have to appropriate very selectively out of, different aspects of the later Heidegger, we have experts here, like my friend Ian, many of you. But you know what I come back to? I come back to On Time and Being. I come back to the Beiträge. I come back to, well, actually, you got to go through the whole Gesamtausgabe, whatever's been published. But the core is really the missing division three of being in time. And the way you go about, for me, making the linkages to respond to this unthought, this ground, this lack of defect, coming back once again, how are you going to encounter Aristotle's paradoxes and then physics and metaphysics? What do you do with Augustine? He's got his own with the Christian structure as the answer. Maybe you go back to Plato. And that, which Heidegger never wrote on or lectured on, as far as I could see, was the Parmenides, which is the most difficult Platonic text, the greatest aesthetic achievement of ancient dialectic, to quote Hegel. The invocation in the introduction of Being in Time, the Parmenides, that Parmenides. Tell me if there's anything harder than that book in the history of Western philosophy. Maybe Hegel's Science of Logic. Okay, maybe that. But that's not that the Being in Time is utterly uncannily different from the structure of the and content of these types of texts. But in Being in Time is a type of Geheimnis. And I'm working on a book chapter for Eric's anthology, but section 74 in the Macquarie Robertson's footnote, the Hellsichtig is the clairvoyance, the seer's trance, the mystical trance, and the Ohnmacht is the powerlessness, death becoming more, the paradoxes of death, Ian, that take us far beyond chapter one that you focus on, and of course you focus on everything, but the superior power and the powerlessness of the Ohnmacht and the swoon and the fainting, so we don't get caught up in just the different types of fates that toss us around, but we have that fixture that gives us this clear vision. Now, to unpack that, though, and give it some real kind of content as a reaction to this gap, it's really the unfinished work of section 65 on ecstatic temporality. The Gleichsprünglichkeit, the ecstasies relate to each other differently. He's just starting, and then he moves through chapter 4, and then he comes up with the schemas, and of course, basic problems will develop this. But I want to link, it may sound like a separate issue in that Gleichsprünglichkeit of the interrelatedness of all those ecstasies and all their possibilities. I am my having beenness, the Kumpftigkeit of the coming and the impending, the end present or making present, but it looks like three ecstasies, but the interrelationships is what you can multiply. And to me, that's linked to the question of movement, which only appears in chapter 5, section 72, 74, 75. The Ratzel, the enigma being, is the enigma of motion. So you have a interrelated movement of the ecstasies that doesn't consist of three. Geometry can't help you. Lines, circles, rectilinear motion. If you want to call onto theology, the Western metaphysical attempt to aufheben the impulses you get from faith, so the Christian narrative specifically, on the kairos or the parousia, the unity of time and eternity, the entire revelation that's embedded in Christianity. Heidegger's going to destroy that too. Anti-Christian. So you can't go back there and you can't repeat. You can hand down and make your choices about what you're going to take from the tradition. You can't just go back and say, well, I'm going to figure out what Aristotle said. This is what Aristotle really meant, or Augustine or Plato, and that's great. So the real issue then is to construct the interrelated movement, the Bewe type, not the Bewegung, the two ends of Dasein, Sein zum Tod and Sein zum Anfang, get some apperception of the Ganzenheit, the wholeness of Dasein. Don't forget the ecstasies, which is a beautiful articulation of what derives our linear sense. And then you're heading back to Hegel in 82, and this is Zusammenhang of Zeitgeist. And I always end my story there because we can't have an endless lecture. But I'm in that case accuse me of being a naive metaphysician. You're constructing something that's pre-Heideggerian by picking and choosing whatever you like out of Being in Time, and then pretending like Hegel, you're going to articulate this massive, complex structure that is an Aufheben of everything else that came before it. But the moments as they fill up, and that whole conception of movement, as he says, in Absolute Knowing, some moments filling themselves up in the whole. We, when our intuition of time is some empty intuition with Kant, see, we may have some intuition of what we think time is, the being of time. We can never articulate it. It's an a priori intuition. It's never an object of experience, right? But it's the manifold. It's what we receive as the manifold through our concepts. We need space and time to be able to think anything about anything and never get to the thing itself. So not going down that path. It's really the rich fullness of a conception of time as a notion But even for Hegel, it's not a linear accumulation. It's not even the classic dogmatic conception of an Aufheben. So it's a third possibility. I've always said this, it's not Heidegger's critique of Hegel, and it's not just some simplistic three-moment idea of Hegel. And I'm not no rub against Robert Pippin's work, but I'm glad my expert friend here is here, and I know a lot of people are thinking about it, but maybe that could be our question. How do we feel about his attempt to say, hey, Heidegger was onto something in terms of his treatment of German idealism, but ultimately, these are the reasons why Heidegger is wrong. Okay, apologies, but I didn't lay out my schemata for the missing division three in this talk, but at least you can see how I relate being in time to these impulses of the later Heidegger. So thank you.
Thank you again, Rajesh, for your intriguing presentation as always. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We'll need to move on. So, anybody has the first question? Yeah, Ian.
Thanks so much, Alfred and Raj. It's always great to get to hear your latest thoughts on all of this. Raj, I know you've been circling the abyss here for 35 years now. So yeah, I think you're getting
Is
deeper.
that how long we've known each other? 91. We've known each other for 33.
33. Wow. So just to pick up on the question you posed at the end about what to make of Pippin's reading of the culmination, the Vollendung, as Hegel. I think one interesting thought about that is that the really great section you're fascinatingly fastening on there from what is called thinking ends with it's on 108 in the English. This Heidegger quoting from the Will to Power notebooks, 617, that everything recurs is the extremest approximation of a world of becoming to the world of being, dash the high point of the meditation. That high point, he calls it the peak that remains wrapped in thick clouds from which Nietzsche had to shrink back in terror. Right? So that's the culmination. The culmination is Nietzsche, not Hegel, I think. But what makes that the culmination of Western metaphysics is that that's the moment where Nietzsche dissolves being into nothing but becoming. Mm-hmm. So I think Heidegger's reading of the nothing as a way to sort of think beyond metaphysics is what he's hinting at there. And just one more thought, I'll leave, you can speak to that one. One more thought was from earlier in your talk where you were talking about the passing away of time. That was so great, by the way, super clear and insightful and interesting and terrifying. And I love how you related it to the real world of our everyday concerns and as its ground and foundation. I'm teaching the origin of the work of art in my later Heidegger class right now, and there's a theme in that I haven't made much of, but it seems actually important, and people like Rathel have argued that it's important, reliability. It's this idea that doesn't really figure very importantly in being in time, but it's in the origin work of art, it becomes something like the being of equipment instead of equipment quality. It's reliability, and reliability is something like the way that equipment resists the passing away or the entropy or the death drive of Husis. That's what makes it reliable, like how it kind of hangs in there against this passing away. So I don't know if you've thought about that at all, but that's to me another interesting avenue that sort of connects to some of your thoughts here. So thank you.
Well, what I know is reliable, Ian, is our friendship. So that's my definition of reliability. But I hear what you're saying. The withering, the passing away gives us the authentic sense of what preserves itself in its deterioration, and we return to it. That's maybe the authentic commitment to. I don't want to simplify it. I mean, you're the greatest when it comes to the complexity of the reading of the shoes and Van Gogh. Let's take it little by little. I think you and I both know, and everyone else knows, that it's the Wiederholung in 74 when he's trying to deal with Geschehen and Geschichtlichkeit. He's going to deal with Schicksal, fate, and Geschick, destiny. So it's a free choice, but it's being handed down, and we actively repeat it. and the appropriation. But by doing that, we're obviously dislodging ourselves from the common knowledge, the history of philosophy that led to our present. For his case, it's phenomenology and neo-Kantianism. So there's this active engagement. Gadamer's going to do something with this fusion of horizons later, but we also know the literature on Nietzsche, which is I love, you can read Deleuze and you can read Klosowski and maybe Foucault and a bunch of other guys, Derrida comes along. But it's not just the being of becoming and the high point, but it's there are a number of ways to play with it, which is I want to distend I'm a sequence of moments in life, and if I distend each one eternally, I'm never going to get to the next link. So how am I going to keep moving along if I'm just blowing up one moment within the circle? Or am I talking about not just living through all the moments and then literally like a video playing it over and over again? Nobody cares about that as a metaphysician. But it's really just this, it's not just the nook stance, the eternal nowness of time frozen with the death of Jesus. If you're going to do something totally different, Zarathustra is against this. Certainly not just falling away in time and beginning and ending, but not a repetition in a circle. Derrida tries to tell Heidegger, look, don't just make, although it seems pretty explicit in different ways that Aristotle and Hegel will come back to a circle. Just to give you a simple example, the end is latent in the origin. It's yet to be actualized. And Hegel, of course, uses the word circle in both the phenomenology and the sense of logic. But getting back to Nietzsche, there's enough in terms of this problem of repetition in section 74 and as you told me, the uses and abuses of history that allows Heidegger to make his ingenious separation in the 30s, the thinking about it. I don't know if I brought up your text here, 108, but I'll just read it again. Everything recurs is the extremist approximation of the world of becoming to the world of being. Put it this way, I could simply think that, wow, I really cannot escape the repetition of my past as I get older because I'm truly effed. Sorry for my European friends here, but I'm reading some American English. I'm truly trying to get away from the trauma. You know this as a young person in those PhD seminars with Derrida, because you and I thought they weren't philosophical. And yet you and I are completely haunted by the trauma of that because, sorry for those who are into comparative literature, but to take seriously a philosophical engagement with Heidegger, having passed through these Derridian types of critiques. So, for example, in Lucien Gramé, is he saying something that would be, if we were no longer talking about time in the ordinary sense, and that is the history of metaphysics, and you wanted to talk about it in a different way, well, you can't use the word time anymore. Is there something more primordial than the ontological difference when he gets into his difference? Let's not go there, but the issue is recurrence for me in being in time is not just the handing down of the tradition or the free choice of what we're going to pick. There is a silhouette of a text inside being in time. This sounds crazy, but that Heidegger couldn't see, that's the Derridian move, that your friend here, the one who's speaking now, is clear as day. I mean, why are you putting movement in section 75, chapter 5, section 72 to 74, 75? And then for me, it's the culmination, it's the apex. He took forever to get to section 65. And okay, finally tell us what the hell you're talking about. But then you should tell me that no, and this is what I appreciate about your work, is you're going to tell us with the forthcoming book. It's now been almost 20 years later that we can still pay homage to the problem of death in a way that's meaning for us in a terrible world that we're living in, and show compassion towards one another. But that doesn't mean sacrificing the greatest and most radical instinct inside Heidegger, which a lot of people are not going to be happy about. They're not going to be happy with the conclusions that you find in the death chapter. But you tell me, you teach us why you think this is going to give us that type of relatedness, given the obscurity here, the unthought, and what he thinks is the problem of the modern age. So I don't know if we have time for that, Alfred, but I want to hear from my friend Ian. I know Akim and our friend Fook is waiting.
To be continued, man. There's a lot of, that was great, but there's a bunch of other people who want to ask questions. So thanks so much.
Thank you for being here.
Okay, I'll try to keep it short.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to listen because I know you have to move on
Yeah,
to the next one. We have Akim. We have to go to Akim next.
yeah.
But Akim, please.
Turn on your mic. I can't hear you from the.
Yes, I didn't notice that. Yeah. Thank you, Rush, for your presentation and for your um, contemplation of the question of time. It seems what you said is that when we ask the question of time, we are led to the question of being, so that maybe um, being in time, there, time needs to be understood as an opposition to being, so that with time um, there is being, and being and time need to be understood in terms of each other. And when you look at our metaphysical and scientific understanding of time as a timeline, we cannot really explain why there is anything because everything is vanishing. But then with the ontological difference, we look at being, of being, and then there is maybe where at that being that leads us to being itself, maybe that is where thinking itself abides. That is where Heidegger wants us to abide and then wonder about the being that we now are relating to, that kind of relationship to being, of being. That is what where thinking has its onset. And I think he wants us to return back in quotation marks, because it's a kind of Wiederholung that is not repetition, but some kind of maybe reappropriation of a way of thinking that we have lost in the metaphysical tradition. And I think the term that is a key term here that you also mentioned is Ursprünglichkeit. Maybe it's not going back to a beginning, but it's going to somehow accessing a region that he calls Ursprünglichkeit, primordiality of being, where we see the place of thinking, and thinking then happen, but thinking not understood conceptually, but it's another kind of thinking. It's a thinking that maybe is a way of resonating with beings and being itself.
I think your beautiful statement, this is 2 seconds, Alfred. You're putting the Denken and the Danken in the Beizug and situating it between not only the being of beings, the ontological difference, but the relationship between being and time, as he's saying here. Not just the book, Being and Time, but the mystery of their relationship. So that's where both the Denken and the Danken have some kind of equiprimordial relationship. It's a gifting that we have from this clearing of not succumbing to the traditional metaphysical questions about being and time, doing something different, which of course Being and Time tries to do, and later Heidegger. Fook. Thank you, Akim.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your very insightful presentation. In your presentation, I think I find Heidegger thinking, Heidegger thought is quite similar to Eastern thought, exactly like Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta, which he proposed human to live in the now. And they say that the future and the past is just illusions.
Right.
So only now is authentic, only now is real, and we live in the eternal now. So my concerns is the entire philosophy careers of Heidegger is try to overcome metaphysics, right? And he even proposed a new way of thinking to overcome metaphysics, which is contemplative thinking, which he deal directly with beings. And then in the what-come thinking, as you show the untaught ground of metaphysics, which is based on linear time, which is based on the trend of past, now, and future. But Heidegger showed that, and Heidegger claimed that only now is real. So my question is, do you think the way of contemplative thinking, which is living with being, has anything to do with the now? Living with being means living with the now. And the new way of thinking, which Heidegger proposed, has something to do with the now. So Eastern thought proposed a way of thinking, which is meditation. Teach us to live in the now. So do you think like meditation is exactly contemplative thinking. And Heidegger thought is exactly like Eastern thought. Do you think so? And that's the first question. And my second question is, could you please say again what is the limit of Heidegger, little Heidegger? Summarize this. What was the limit of Heidegger as you presented in your presentation? Could you summarize in like some second from me again? Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Fook. Alfred, 1 minute. Count the seconds and you can stop me. 60 seconds. Okay, I'll keep in mind because I know we're waiting for Akim's talk to round up the day. It's been a long day. Thank you, Fook. Those are great questions because, you know, the literature on Heidegger and Eastern thought is quite vast and has some history. And there's some really great works coming out now. We have a colleague in I don't know if he's still in Hong Kong, but Eric has a book on, I think, Heidegger and the Tao. And my friends like Akim and Alfred and Ian know that I'm of Indian ancestry. But I grew up in the West, and I feel like I've been made by continental thinkers, so German and French. So I feel like that's really what my inside Dasein and Wesen is. So it's hard for me to relate to my own the Eastern answer, but I do know something about it. I want to differentiate Heidegger from both ontotheology, Western metaphysics, the history of philosophy, Christianity. When we talk about the Ursprünglichkeit, and then the time eternity and the now structures. So we know that Heidegger is doing something totally unique and different that's destroying that. The limit is that he couldn't cross his own, the instantiation of how we're not supposed to go about talking about these things, whether it's being or time, in terms of the presence, the present now. Everything is present in our presence now. So you can't even have a concept or a conversation. So do you stay silent? Is it mystical? Okay. But I also have to differentiate it from the East because my construction, and this is where I'll end, Alfred, is I take the ecstasies, I take the Gleichspurigkeit, and I really play around with them. And what I discovered is a long time ago, maybe because of the Derrida influence, but he doesn't do anything with this, is that you're going to have to question this idea of an origin being present as past and as something in the future. Because there's no kairos or parousia, you can't just take the antinomies of non-origin, non-end like eternity. So now you have for origin and non-origin, non-end, but these all have alterities. And whether it's Levinas or Derrida, the French may have played around with this a bit, but they don't articulate something as systematic as being in time. So for me, the construction involves a four-dimensionality of interrelationships between these polarities that gets me way past any kind of Heideggerian schema of past, present, and future, especially the early Heidegger when he's thinking more, kind of in that metaphysical registers of schemas and concepts, metaphysical foundations of logic, the extematic temporality, whatever's happening in basic problems too. It's my own thing, and now most people don't care about it, or they say, well, this has nothing to do with Heidegger. But the hardest thing I've spent 30 years of my life trying to figure out how to express is that this is coming directly out of weaving all the parts of Heidegger, which is the late and the early and everything else I can find. But it's obviously my own intuition that's crossing the limit. So the answer is that it's not Heidegger crossing any limit. It's what I'm attempting to do, and that I hate to say is very arrogant, but it's my claim. So thank you.